Okay, guys, welcome back. This is your old pal Hondo, and we're doing a basically sort of like a survival video, but we're going to be talking about ancient tools that basically our ancient ancestors used from the Bible times, either for fishing, agriculture, and into like writing on papyrus and ancient pens, the type of things that they used to write the Bible with as well. This is a very early example of a ancient pen, very reminiscent to our feathered quills that we used in the 1800s. These were either made out of hollowed bones from birds, and they would use some kind of like cotton material in the back end to make a reservoir, like right in here. But they would hollow it out at the very tip would be a small hole in that tip that they would put some kind of material in between there to make the reservoir for the pen. This is probably the very same type of pens they were using in Josephus's time to write on parchment, like papyrus parchments, to write basically stuff from the Dead Sea Scroll era. Um, and it's very reminiscent to like the pens that we used in the 1800s and the 1700s in our own modern era. It's very similar to a modern pen as well because most modern like inkwell pens have a little sponge at the top, which was the reservoir that would soak up the ink and then eventually kind of like drip down into the tip to make an ancient pen. But this is basically what they used to write the Bible with. This is an ancient pen right here. This is as old as time itself. As you can see right here, it says in Jesus' day, this is a writing tool made of metal, ivory, or bone. So basically, it's a bone tool, like I said. And it's they would write on papyrus parchment with it, and they'd use a wax table, whatever. So down a waxed surface. However, a more permanent method was blah blah blah. Basically just to get the gist of it. They would write on skins, papyrus, paper. Paper was really expensive to make, and they used pulp. And not everybody could afford to, or were even educated. Like most common people weren't very educated unless you were part of the priestly class in Israel at the time in ancient times. So you wouldn't know how to read basically. Jesus might have been the exception because Joseph was related to the priestly class and he was a carpenter. As a carpenter, it was part of the tools of the trade to learn how to read, to do measurements, and to be precise about how far you got to cut a piece of wood, or you know tap out a stone to build a stone house, or how long the mud brick had to be with the little preformed boxes they made to make mud bricks to build homes in the ancient times, in like places like Nazareth, Galilee, even in Bethlehem as well, because most of the modern materials that they would make their homes from were basically mud bricks, and they would build like a small like rocket stove made out of mud bricks inside their homes, and basically use that to make their breads, and they make clay pots and stuff like that because most poor people in the ancient time couldn't really afford cast bronze pots and pans, so a lot of them used. That's why you go to like a lot of these biblical archaeology sites and they find a lot of broken pots and like broken pots and stuff. Those were actually used either for water, and they used the clay to make cooking pots. Those were used as cooking pots in fires because clay does kind of retain heat a lot better than you know bronze. But basically, cast bronze pots were only used by the upper echelon of the elite class in Israel, um, or modern day Judah. Not everybody could afford that, and if they did have a pot and pan like that in their family, they would pass it down. They would pass it down. With one family member dying, it would go to another family member. It was something that was so valuable that they wouldn't just throw them out. They would pass them down from family member to family member. But if that family member was still alive and they still had that pot, they had to use clay until that family member died and you inherited it. So, you know, that's how things were. People were poor back then. Um, like I said, they used papyrus to write on with this pen. They also used clay as well. They would roll out of some clay and they would use a bone pen like this to write in clay, or a stick to write in clay in whatever, like Aramaic language or Roman language or Greek language that they were using to write on clay tablets. Um, they they would write also, like they would have these like stamps in the rings that they would put in these clay tablets as an official seal. If you were more of a important person, you had affluence, you would have seals. Basically, a seal or a clay seal was for poor people. You had to have a clay seal in order to barter or trade. You had to give your family seal and crest on everything that you did. Once you, even if you didn't know how to write, that family seal would be pushed in clay on land deals, on um, if they were buying land or they were coming to an agreement, that way their family seal was on there at all times. Even poor people had seals. Each family member had like a clay or jasper seal that they would carve into a piece of jasper or jade, and they would use it as a seal. That way they knew when they made deals or they traded or whatever, they had that in writing with the family seal. So that, this whole modern concept of, writing was not really a thing. I mean, each family had a crest and a seal, so they would use the seal. They mean the seal and family cresting even goes into the medieval times as well, for bartering and trading. So people did carry around. If you want to look at it, like in ancient Sumeria in Mesopotamia, which was like 4,000 years ago, they found a ton of Sumerian, Babylonian, and Syrian seals from each one of these family members that were living in those areas. When they would write out in cuneiform, they would use that seal to seal a deal. The whole saying, to seal the deal, came from that ancient saying, because people used seals back in the day, because if they didn't know how to write, they could just use their family seal, and bada bing, bada boom, you got yourself a deal. And that was binding in that clay or papyrus, um, cuneiform type of writing situation to use these pens for. Okay, now we're done with ancient writing in the biblical times and what they use seals for and stuff like that. And you can use this in a modern, like standpoint too, for survival. You make a pen out of a hollow chicken bone, and if you want to make a writing device, and you can make inks out of charcoal from your fire and water, and mix it really thick to make a ink, and you can make your own pen to write on, whatever. If you wanted to make a writing type of utensil, you can make it out of a chicken bone or a hollow bird bone, and then put some kind of like spongy material behind that as a reservoir to make a pen. Very important tool that you can use even in a modern survival standpoint is make a quilled pen out of a chicken bone. So there's that. Okay, now we're on this website. This is we're going to the agriculture part of our video here, how people basically did farming back in the ancient times. Now, they didn't just grow wheat and other vegetables, they also grew certain types of plants to harvest to make cordage, or even what you would call, materials to weave stuff and stuff like that. Because most ancient in ancient times, cotton was very expensive. Only the upper, very influential people around the world could afford cotton, and even silk was even worth more than gold itself. So most commoners that lived in ancient Israel at the time probably grew hemp. They probably grew other fibrous materials to make their clothing in, because they didn't have sheep. Sheep wasn't really a native animal to the ancient Israel times. uh, they didn't have sheep. They didn't have wool. Wool wasn't a thing. Um, Plus that wool was basically like the northern tribes of England and places like that. Wool was very prevalent in those areas. You know what I mean? Sheep weren't prevalent in the Middle East at the time that I know of. I know goats were. They probably used goat skin to make clothing as well. But most of the clothing that poor rural people that they were growing were probably like I don't know if they have milkweed there, but I know here we use yucca, we use agava to make natural cordages. They probably grew plants based on the region to grow natural cordage type of plants in the wild. So they would grab their seed pods and grow that right along with wheat and barley and other stuff like that, which was basically oatmeal and stuff like that was a main food staple for most of the Jewish tribes to make lentil breads and to make you know, stuff like that. But I think they also grew other plants for cordages, so they could, make cordages to make their hoes, their ads to hollow out stuff to make tables. Jesus was a carpenter, so a lot of these natural fibers and cordages they would have used in the building process of building shelters out of mud bricks and they would have grew this stuff like agave, maybe probably yucca grows there. I'm not sure. I know milkweed for sure. You can make cordage out of. Dog's bane is another plant that they make cordage from. Native Americans did. Also, they would use these cordages to make their fishing nets and their long line fishing kits in the Sea of Galilee as well. I think, when Jesus left Nazareth as a preacher, he was probably a traveling preacher. He wasn't just a preacher. He had a trade. He was a carpenter. And most carpenters of the time didn't or couldn't afford metal tools because, iron was a very expensive material and not everybody had them, and if they did have iron tools they were passed down from father to son to father to son as well. I think Jesus probably used a lot of stone tools as well with, um, you know, maybe bronze, but they were very expensive, just like surgical tools were back in the ancient times as well, made out of copper or bronze. They were very expensive. Not everybody knew how to smelt the stuff or even find it or locate it. So if they did have tools like that, they would cherish them and pass them down from family member to family member. And not very many people could afford bronze tools, bronze pans. That's why I said earlier in the video, people used clay pots to cook in because they were poor. You know what I mean? Jesus was like sort of like in the working trades class type of families, basically a jack of all trades and a jack of none, or whatever the old saying is with jack of all trades. He wasn't just a carpenter; he was probably a mason. He probably had tools with him to cut stone into smaller pieces, like probably little preforms to make mud bricks out of clay and straw to build homes, and then heat those bricks up in a kiln, because most villages had kilns built into the villages out of basically clay kilns, so they can make their own pottery. It was basically a communal kiln. um, and Jesus probably used a lot of like stones to as rasps, to smooth out wood, to sand it down. He probably had different grades of like stones to like, grade down wood once you cut it to build stuff from it, like roofing, chairs, tables, you know, um, other like wooden bowls and stuff like that. I mean, just a plethora of stone tools he would have probably used. He probably wouldn't just have used metal tools. If he did have metal tools, they were really expensive and they cherished them. You know what I mean? And most tools that they use, like, you get this whole thing in bushcrafting community that you need a full tang knife and it needs to be solid carbon steel. Well, not very many people use knives made out of carbon steel. they used knives like what Uzi Man, when they found Uzi Man in the Italian Alps, he was a 4,000-year-old perfectly preserved human being. He wore jute clothing. He had a jute cloth over his body. He wore that as like fibers that they wove into a like a shirt and pair of pants. He wore jute shoes as well, made out of jute twine, fashioned into shoes. He Everything that he had cordage wise was jute cordage that was woven into clothing, and that was probably weatherproofed by dipping that clothing into uh, beeswax, which would give it some kind of water resistance as well. Basically, it was an early form of a type of canvas that they used to wear as clothing. Even in ancient times, not everybody could afford cotton clothing. It was very expensive. Cotton was worth its weight in gold, so not very many people in ancient Israel could afford cotton clothing because cotton was probably just as much expensive as silk was coming in from China in the ancient times. So a lot of people probably used either jute or another type of plant that grew in the region to make clothing from. And then if they wanted to weatherproof it, they probably dyed it, dipped it into wax to basically make it weatherproof to, because basically, when they wore togas and stuff like that back in the old days, or robes, those robes, they also carried an extra robe around their body, like prayer robes in the ancient times. Those prayer robes could be also used as shelters. Why do you think in the Bible, people, they talk about how powerful a staff was? People, not the whole shepherd staff, like where it had a hook and stuff like that. That's probably not the staffs they used, but like a walking stick was very important in their survival kits, was because they used that as a ridgepole to use their backup, um, prayer rugs that they used, that the Jewish people used back in the old days with the little like purple dyed ends on it. They used those as shelters, and they used those staffs as ridge poles to build their shelters and tents. They carried their tents on them. You know what I'm saying? When Jesus was in Galilee and places like that, when he wanted to build a shelter, he carried a staff on him. Everybody carried a staff on him. Abraham carried a staff. A staff was probably the most powerful weapon in ancient times because they could use it to defend themselves. They could use it to prop up their shelters as well. A staff was very important in ancient times. It wasn't just a tool to defend yourself. Moses had one, Abraham had one. It was a very important tool that they used to make a ridgeline shelter out of their, uh, fibrous plant material cloths that they made, that they carried with them into the field. They could soften these cloths by, wearing them down, to make the cordage, to make the strings, to basically make these like extra shelter cloths with them. I don't know what materials exactly they used. I know my ancient ancestors used dog's bane to make you know fibrous materials, to twist it into cordage, to weave into like clothing. They used nettle, they used milkweed, they used yucca and agave. But like I said, they do it with hemp too. They make modern day hemp clothing. So it was cheaper to make and harvest and grow these plants in their region to make clothing, because cotton was very expensive and so was silk. So most common people, if they were wearing clothing in ancient biblical times, it was made out of some kind of natural material that had been dyed either white or blue or red or purple or whatever to make it more appealing, you know what I mean, or a pleasing to the eye, you know what I'm saying. So we're talking about agriculture. They grew wheat, they probably grew cotton as well, but they couldn't use the cotton themselves if they were growing it in the Holy Land because it was too expensive, and they probably sold it so they could pay their temple taxes and whatever empire at the time that had conquered Israel to pay taxes to them too. So basically, you were pretty well screwed back in the day if you didn't pay your temple taxes for tithes, and if you didn't pay your taxes to Rome or Greece or Persia at the time, they would have took your land, enslaved you, blah blah blah, yada yada yada. You know what I mean? In Cana and in those regional areas, they would also use stone tools as well. Like I said, we'll get into that really quick. Jesus talked often about the land and the products in his teachings, showing he was familiar with farming. Of course, Jesus would have been very familiar with farming in ancient times. Now, this was like an early form of a calendar. Like I said, they would take big globs of clay and use a small bone pen to write in it in Aramaic, like an Aramaic language or cuneiform or hieroglyph, whatever they were using at the time. Even people in ancient Israel were still writing in hieroglyphs because that part of Cana was ruled by either Greek Philistines or they were ruled by the Egyptians. Basically, they were kind of a mix between Canaanite, Philistine, Greek, and early days in the Egyptian, because that part of Canaan was a part of the Egyptian Empire. That's sort of where Aramaic language kind of came from, spawned from like Egyptian influences with Sumerian influences, because Abraham came from Ur, which was a city in Iraq that was part of the Akkadian Empire 4,000 years ago. So you kind of get the cuneiform language that was based on the old Israeli Hebrew language, Aramaic, whatever you want to call it. They would use calendars as basically like an ancient almanac for growing times and what times of the season were good and what time, basically like a farmer's almanac. This is like the farmer's almanac of its day. Get into like, irrigation and farming. This was used by the Egyptians for a long time. They would dam off one section of a river, and basically it would fill this like reservoir up, and they would have like this little water wheel with like openings that would gather water, and it would pick up the water and put it in a small creek, that man-made creek, like a uh, basically a canal that would lead out to their wells in their villages or their you know their 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 gardens. And the water itself, by when it would run through a river, it would pick that water up, and the natural power from the river's current would push the water wheel with the little clay jars, as you can see there, into a small man-made canal, which would go into a village, or you know or they would do this in a spring or whatever to get the water to go to their crops on the land where they've basically plowed it out in order to irrigate their farms, or they would use it to fill up their wells as well. They built wells, and they would build these irrigation canals to basically go to that well, and then they could fill that well up with the water that they open up from the lock on the dammed up portion of a small creek or the side of a creek to get the water to point A to point B. Native Americans also did a very similar thing. The Hopi Indians would do the same thing as well as, the farmers did in ancient Israel at the time for irrigation. This is how they got water from point A to point B. And here you go, right here is some cuneiform. I don't know if this is Egyptian, but it's definitely of the time of the Bible. Grains, grapes, they grew olives, they grew, grapes for wine and fruit, figs, olives for olive oils, because, they made clay lamps, and, they would use long strips of fibrous material in their clay lamps, and they would use olive oil to basically fuel the lamps so they can, use it as a light source. Because you got to think, wax was very rare and very expensive in Bible times. It was only used for very certain things, like coating their nets for fishing, or their long lines from the fibrous material. They would just use a very small amount of wax on their natural cordages to, very expensive. Wax was very expensive. It was used only for clothing and coating their cordages for either fishing or shelter building and stuff like that. Wax was rare. It itself was worth a lot of money as well. Olive oil wasn't worth as much money, and in Israel they found tons of olive presses that were used for thousands of years, especially at the Mount of Olives. They found a bunch of old olive presses that they would use, that they would push around in a circle. It would crush the olives into a oily substance, and they would use that oil to use for lantern fuel. To oil, the oil was used to heat up their lamps, and their lamps were used basically like candles, and it was a lot cheaper to use. And like what we got kerosene lanterns today, um, those were invented way before kerosene lanterns were. They were kind of windproof, and they were used in every home, basically like what you call a genie lamp. Like you rub the genie lamp and poof, the genie comes out. But those were actually lanterns that they used, made out of bronze. But early, like in the ancient times, they had similar lanterns, lamps like that, but they were made out of clay. They found plenty of examples in Israel at the time of clay oil lanterns, but they used olive oil for that, and they use it for cooking as well. Just basically what we use it for now. This is how they wrote stuff in clay tablets. Most of this writing was done with like a small like piece of bone. They used either a giant seal to roll it out. They could do that. They can carve, make it into a clay tablet. They could just roll it. It looked like, if you want to look at ancient seals, they were like round cylindrical discs. They would roll over clay after they were the printing presses of their time. They basically invented the printing press to make clay tablets that would go out throughout the empires as news. You know what I mean? They would take these clay tablets everywhere, and those clay tablets could be dipped in ink and put on papyrus, and sent out like that as well. You know what I mean? So these clay tablets were like the newspapers of their time, books, whatever. So very important. As you can see here, there's some seeds they found in probably some like pristine state, and some clay jars. Clay jars were also used as storage as well. They had storage clay jars, and they had cooking clay jars, and they had like wine clay jars that would store wine. Like in Jesus's time, when they had that wedding for I think it was Joseph of Arimathea, when he went to the wedding, they were using giant clay jars that had like little spouts in them to pour the wine into smaller vessels that they would go around the table, clay vessels, to pour the wine. In Jesus' time, about the time Jesus made water into wine, they would use clay jars as storage. And most of the time when they were storing grain and stuff like that, in these clay jars, they would seal it with a piece of wood on top, and then they would put clay around the top. That way they would seal it to keep bugs from getting into it. Stuff like oatmeal and barley grain and stuff like that were found in Egyptian tombs that were over 3,000 years old, and you could still eat it. That's how well preserved it was. Even honey, too. I mean, honey has lactic acid in it, and they stored honey in jars as well. And it was thousands of years old, and they could still eat the honey. It's very interesting. You guys could look that up. You know what I mean, as well. This is the ancient well systems that they would build in each one of the villages to catch rain, or like I said, the water wheel would bring in water from the aqueduct that they would build, basically a canal, and they would run it into a pool, and they would take their time and refill these wells back up, that way they would have this as a water source when drought times would happen, to water their plants or drinking water that they could store in these wells. Now sometimes they would dig a well to a natural spring underneath it. It would fill back up once they lined it with bricks after they dug it, and they would line it with bricks. But water wells do go dry, and in our own 18th and 19th century in America, we had wells here too that would do the same thing. They would either catch rain or they would dig one underneath a aquifer or a natural spring and basically have your water as a backup reservoir in lean times when you had drought. Here you go, farming right here, guys. Now this is like a picture of a plow and a axe. There's a guy cutting a tree with an axe. This is what Jesus probably would have been using at the time as a carpenter. His father would have used it as well, Joseph. I don't know if it was Joseph of Arimathea. I don't really know all the names and stuff, but this is what the type of axes they would have used, like a stone axe, to fell trees. And they had this right here. This tool this guy's holding right here is a wheat whip. It was made out of basically a hinged piece of wood with another piece of hinged wood. After they would harvest the wheat, they would take a wheat whip and stack up the wheat stalks on the ground, and they would whip it with the wheat whip. And it would knock all the little pieces of wheat out of its little pods onto a burlap sack, or like a little fibrous mat that they would lay it on, and then they would sift through it and take out the outer barks of the wheat stalks of the plant to get to the oatmeal, the oat part of it, to where they could mill it down and turn it into lentil flour. They could eat it as oatmeal, like a curd, basically a porridge they would make out of the oatmeal as well. Which, porridge is really one of the oldest forms of uh, food that people ate back in the ancient times. They called it oatmeal or porridge. They grind it down. Basically, we call it grits here in the United States, but it was called porridge. They would make a stew out of it. The ancient people would in their clay jars and make porridge. It was really easy because most, people from Bible times couldn't afford meat. Meat was really expensive, and it was only meant for rich people. And if farmers did raise cattle and stuff, they were usually raising cattle for a lord or a priestly class, like type of lord over the land type of situation, and they couldn't afford to eat it that much. And then if they did eat meat, it was more like uh, a fish, like lamb based diet, and they didn't eat meat all the time. They basically ate plants more than they did meat. And if they did process an animal up or sacrifice an animal to whatever god they worshipped at the time, they would eat the inner organs, would go to the poor, and the meat, fleshy meat portions of it would go to the richer, higher class, upper echelon families. The poor people would eat like birds. They would eat bugs, like grasshoppers. They would eat, they had a really based diet. I mean, was it John the Baptist? He lived in the wild. He only sustained himself on honey and water and grasshoppers. That's all he ever ate. You know what I mean? And lentil bread probably too. If you look in the Bible, what John the Baptist ate when he lived in the wilderness preaching to the masses. But right here, as you can see, now they made these plows out of wood. They probably interlocked the wood together using wooden plugs to hold them together. They probably used, the yoke on their oxes to basically pull along the plow with natural materials like leather harnesses with like a natural cordage on the plow to lead the oxen around by the nose with a now they would put a small like piercing in the ox's nose to basically like lead them around which way they wanted the ox to go, like a metal hook in the nose, like a little round ring, so they would move the oxes around for their plows. Now, if you see this plow here, most plows were probably they used like a obsidian head as a plow head, or they probably used a big um, jade or maybe a flint type of stone for the head of the plow, because most iron tools or even a iron or maybe a cast bronze head would be too expensive, and most farmers couldn't afford that because most of them lived off the land anyways. So they probably used a stone like flint head tied hafted to a bigger piece of wood while the guy was holding on to the front of the plow. But they probably used a big stone head like they would with the axes. Now the axe would have either been stone or bronze. Bronze would have been more of an expensive axe, and most poor rural people couldn't afford it, so they probably used the stone axe head, like basically a hafted axe head in between two pieces of wood tied down with some kind of cordage to make a stone axe. Like I said, bronze axe heads would have been extremely expensive, and most poor people couldn't afford those type of axe heads, and so they probably predominantly used stone material to make their axes. I mean, they were still using stone tools in the Bronze Ages. I mean, even in our time in the industrial age in the 1800s, people were still using bronze knives and stuff like that, and sickle size and stuff like that to cut and harvest wheat here in the United States. Even Native Americans were still using kind of like bronze arrowheads. Iron was very expensive, the tedious process in smelting it. So if they did have metal tools, they were hard to come by. And if they did have them, they were heirlooms, so they passed them down to family. Uh, right here is basically what you see the modern day of, how they were farming in Israel with oxes, but they would have these big ass rings in their noses that would lead them around from right to left, however they wanted the oxen to go in plowing. This is more of a modern technique of what they were doing, as this picture, as you can see, but it's still the same concept. A plow, they had the oxes pull the plow, and underneath it, it would either have this one probably has an iron head, but ancient times they probably would have used stone heads and stuff like that for their plow heads. Um, Here you go. Again, it's another picture of the ancient ox plow with a stone head that was probably flint knapped to a point to basically till up the fields. This is probably an ancient Egyptian depiction on ancient hieroglyph, tomb walls and stuff like that. As you can see right here, they had probably like bronze sickle as a harvester. Now that's probably where they would splurge on a harvester, but if they didn't have that, they would use a piece of flint to cut it down. Most farmers probably were using flint harvester tools made made from flint, hafted onto a piece of wood that they would use like a sickle, like a piece of flint sickle, to basically cut down their wheat and whatever type of situation they were in. Now we could still use stone tools today to reap and crop our crops as well. We could use a stone tool, like say if you don't have a modern knife, you could find some, like go to riverbanks and find flint, or depends on what part of the region you live in. See here we have flint, chert, and what's that little white stone called? Well, I can't remember, but stone and flint and chert is very common here, so we can find it in the creeks and stuff like that. And but out west, like in California and places like Oregon, is obsidian. Now, obsidian is a great tool if that's what you can find. Obsidian can be used as a harvesting tool as well. You could, if you have some skills in flint knapping, you can flint knap yourself a sickle scythe. If you don't have anything like that in a survival scenario, in a modern survival scenario, and you don't have a knife and you get thrusted and you get lost out in the wild, you can find chert, you can find quartz, you can find obsidian, or you can find some kind of stone tool near riverbanks. The way I like to find flint when I go to the river, sometimes I'll take a big hammerstone and I'll bounce a stone off of pieces of stone. And when you hit like jade, or you hit like a flint or a chert, it'll make a long dinging noise, like ding, like you're hitting a piece of metal with a stone. If it doesn't make that dinging noise, you don't have a solid like flint, chert, or type of quartz. Um, there's a lot of false chert and a lot of false, what they call false flint as well. But the majority you'll find flint, and when you do, you could break, find the ledges on the stone and hit it with another stone, and it'll flake it off. Or you could put the stone in fire to temper it to make it more brittle, and you could hit those little ledges. And you don't have to have like really good tool making skills to start out with. If you don't have a knife in a survival situation, you can find that flint, knock it off, flake it off once you temper it in a fire, and you get your first fire going. And you could use that tool either as a hand axe or to as a scraper. You could use it to cut bark off of trees, to cut your dog's bane or your milkweed. It's a knife. You could use it to saw stuff too. Ancient man used hand axes, made from flint, pieces of flint, more refined ones, but you could use them as a saw to cut down, cut a piece of wood, green wood, to a point where you can push it over and like break it off, and then use it as a scraper. You can use like sandstone to flatten it out once you scrape all the bark off of a plant to, whatever, you know what I'm saying? Weaving cordage as well was very important in the ancient times. They didn't have the luxury of paracord, and if you run out of paracord, then you're going to have to start learning how to make cordage as well. But basically, they would use a stone harvester like this, or they would use a bronze or copper sickle sly to process up their stuff. Like I said, even in a survival scenario, you could still use stone tools as well. But this is basically the type of tools they used in ancient Israel. Right here is a sickle sly, probably made from bronze or copper. Their clothing in itself in ancient times would be very reminiscent to this. This is probably more modern times. They took this picture, so they're probably wearing cotton. But in Jesus's time, they would have used um, natural materials to make their clothing, because what you're seeing here in modern times is cotton was more cheap and cost effective. People can afford it more now these days, but in ancient times, cotton was very valuable, and not common people had it. You know what I'm saying? And they wore their togas or their robes made from natural materials like hemp, maybe. They probably used some kind of yucca or agave plant. I don't know what really grows in Israel. I'm not too keen on the plants, but I'm just basically going by what we use in America as natural material to make their clothing. This is more of a modern standpoint of what they did harvesting in Israel, probably in the 1940s. It's a really old picture, but they see the sickle sly right there. But they would have teams of people going out and cutting down wheat or barley or whatever type of crops they were growing, because you can see this is a modern picture. Corn, you can see corn and maize in the background. Maize is a North American plant that probably, in the mid eight like 16 to 1700s, they introduced into the old world. They started growing corn there. Corn wasn't in the old world in Jesus's time, so you got corn growing in the background here. So this is a more modern picture, but it's still the same concept of how they harvested wheat back in the old days, because they only had like tomato plants, figs, grapes, olives, and they harvested wheat and barley, and they didn't have maize. So this is more of a modern picture. But you could also, the cool thing about corn husks, like dried out corn husks, can be made into cordage as well. So cattails, agave, hemp. Probably they were growing hemp back then, or a weed that was very close and similar to hemp that they made cordage. They would use cordage combs that were made out of little bronze, comb uh, type of things, and they would dry out the material, then rake it over the comb to get the fibers to come out once it's dried out. Once they process the material down and to make cordage, to weave into like a spinning wheel, to weave it into a cordage, they would probably have some kind of like equivalent of a basically spindle and a wheel to weave cordage. in ancient times. There's plenty of videos out there on how they make rope and stuff from ancient, uh, like in ancient times with machines, hand cranked machines to weave their cordage. But if you don't have that, most poor people probably use their hands to roll it up and use cordage combs to make stuff like that. Even even Jesus probably used fibrous materials laced with wax to basically um, make cordage. This is basically wheat bundles. They would gather the wheat in these big bundles and use wheat whips to whip it into smaller grains and then pull, like they would take these little round wicker type of um, baskets to sift through the good from the bad from the wheat. There's right here, as you can see, wine and oil, but this is wheat actually. They're basically throwing the wheat up and throwing all the bad materials, fibrous materials, out of the wheat. Here's how they made wine in ancient times. They stomped on it. They put the grapes in like a brick type of bath, and they would just sit there and stomp on the grapes, and the grapes juice would come out here in a small um, like spillway in with a little hollow tube there, and they would probably have a guy there grabbing the grape juice and with a small like spoon or something and dumping it into the clay jars right here, and they would store those clay jars in a dark damp area, basically like a wine cellar, and allow them to fermentate into a wine, and everybody would drink wine very rarely. Wine wasn't drunk all the time in ancient times by like common poor people. They didn't drink it all the time, and when the only times they drank it was during festival days or weddings or Passovers or holidays. They didn't drink wine all the time. Wine was basically drunk by like the elite class all the time. You know what I mean? But poor people, they probably, I'm just guessing, they probably drink wine only on very festive days like weddings, Passover, Hanukkah, stuff like that on their holidays, or when or whatever. But they didn't drink wine all the time because they couldn't afford it. Wine was very expensive, and only rich upper class, like like Romans or Persians or Greeks or whoever was at the time, or the priesthood class, could drink all the time. And I think in the Bible it says you're not supposed to drink to excess. So in the Bible times they couldn't get drunk. They could drink to a point. If they got drunk, it was a sin. So you couldn't really. Plus that too, they lived in the desert. If you know anything about drinking wine in hot climates, you will pass out. Literally, it'll knock you out. There's instances in the Bible, of wars where their enemies would get drunk on victory, and then because of the desert heat don't mix well with wine, they would pass out for hours, literally hours, like in Abraham's time, like when Lot went into Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Moabite tribes went up against Sodom and Gomorrah and defeated the Sodom kings. Um, they took Lot as a prisoner, and Abraham had to come in and save them. Well, they had got drunken on victory on wine, and if you know anything about like in the desert, you drink wine, it dehydrates you and knocks you the fudge out. So it made it to where Abraham could go in there and knock the Moabites out to basically, you know, free his nephew Lot from bondage. So wine is very significant and symbolic in Bible times. Like with Jesus, with the my body, my blood, and my ritual. This is my body, this is my blood. You do this in remembrance sakes of me. You know, basically ritual wine rituals in like um, in Catholic traditions of Christianity. Now this is where they sometimes they would crop the grain in these like little holes here, and they would take a big wooden stick and just like bam, bam, bam to grind it down. That's more of a small stage farmer would do that to grind it down into flour. If it was a bigger, you know, uh, a bigger like farming co-op, they would use a big wheel, a grist wheel that would go around in circles. They would either mount an animal to it, or some like the villagers themselves would push on it to make it go in a circle to basically crush the olives down into either oil or a paste. Then they would squeeze it into oil in a like a press. So this is basically how they would turn their grain into either flour, wine, or oil. Is a small hole they would drill into a stone like that, and then beat it to death with a long wooden pole, basically to grind it down like a mill grist type of situation. They also had, right here, this is basically, I think this is a stone laid grain, also silo. This is a silo they stored the grain in, but basically they would put like a silo down in the ground in the cold where they would store jars and they store grain and stuff like that in these silos. They would have probably like a type of thatched roof on this silo. That way animals couldn't get in, bugs couldn't get into it. They could store their communal, like a food bank for the village. Basically this is how they made their silos. Now this, I think, is a harvesting early fields working. Let's see, Stone Age made sharpened flint, wooden digging. So this is basically like a hoe. This is either a flint hoe or a bronze hoe that they were using to till up their, for agriculture for small farms. Most of them couldn't afford, probably, so they would make like stone hoes, like mattocks or ads. They would use these to plow up their fields to make, when they plowed, to basically make mounds so they can grow their stuff in it. This is basically a bronze hoe. This is probably what they would have been using, was bronze hoes. If they couldn't afford a bronze hoe, they would probably make one from a piece of bone or a piece of flint, like it said right here. Would have to a piece of wood that had like a bend in it, like a bent shaped piece of wood, and they would have a long handle on it, and they would half the piece of bone or a stone flint head to make a hoe for harvesting. These would have been more expensive. Probably more rich farmers would probably have been able to afford, you know, bronze plow heads. I mean, they were probably using bronze stuff even into the Iron Age, because we found examples of Iron Age sites in England. They were still like the Celtic people, like the Pikeys. Uh, the Pikes would still use bronze swords. They were using bronze hoes. They were using bronze axe heads. They were using bronze wedges to bust wood up, to like split wood and stuff like that. So that was like almost 2,500 years ago, and they were still using bronze tools even in the Iron Age. It just shows you, although they were still using iron, but iron were more used for swords, spears, and armor than it was more for agriculture. Most people couldn't afford. I mean, if you're like talking about rural people starting out, they were even still using stone tools in England 2,000 years ago for knives, harvesting tools, stone plows. Bronze was really expensive, and not everybody could afford it. And if they did, it would cost you a significant amount of money to afford that. See, like right here, you see the plows. Even some plows are just wooden, like pieces of wood. They didn't even tip it with a stone or anything like that. Sometimes they just use a wood plow to harvest crops. As you can see right here, here's some of the tools they used. Like I said, here's a stone that they would grind that down into flour. It's basically a mill grist. And over here you have tools. You have a bronze sickle scythe, another bronze probably sickle scythe, then you have a stone one. So you have all three different versions. You probably have a bronze, an iron, and a flint sickle scythe. This is just three examples of it. And here's an axe. This is how they would make an axe. They would, take a stone tool and cut a center out and put a small, like hard piece of flint in that, and then haft it in there with like pitch pine and rope to tie it into place to make an axe. And let me tell you, hitting an axe, a stone axe into a tree is a pain in the butt. It sends a lot of shock, and it takes a lot longer to cut down trees with stone axes and stuff like that. But this is basically the tools they would use to make bread, lentil bread, and to grind down their olive oil, or their, to grind down their basic oat grains or barley grains to make beer. They made beer out of barley. They would ferment barley and make a rudimentary beer that would blow your brains out because it was so strong, in just raw form of making beer. And they would leave it in water, and they would probably add berries to it to kind of give it a flavor, like a decent tasting flavor to get drunk off of, right along with wine. I don't know what this is here exactly, but here wine vineyards, they've been growing wine in the Palestinian region for decades. Now this is a wine press, oil press. They had oil presses in the ancient times as well. About the Roman times, they started really getting refined with olive oil presses. They could press these little olive oils down in these, like, you know, sinew and counterbalance lever type of wine presses of the ancient times. Now, this is a Roman wine press, but they also had them for olive oils too. Now, this is in the Roman times. That's when they really got more advanced. When you started talking about making olive oil and wine and stuff like that, they actually started using presses instead of stomping on the grapes or using a stone grist mill to, you know, press the olives down. They'd use a big heavy grist mill to press them down, squeeze them into another container to make oil. So, they started using presses. It was a lot easier, it's simpler. It took a lot less manpower to do it. Instead of, using 5 or 6 people to run a grist wheel, they could use like 2 or 3 guys to press it, feed it, press it, put it in the clay pots, moving them out of the way, putting another clay pot near the spout to get their oil or their wine. So it was very inventive. The Romans really invented a lot of cool stuff that, we take advantage of. We think we invent, with counter pulleys and rope cordage. You can see all the pulleys in the background here on this picture, and the rope counterbalance pulleys and stuff like that. They made sugars out of, fruit trees. In America, in our early times, we made sugar out of maple syrup, maple trees. We would put a small metal, like bronze tube in maple trees, and we would drill a small hole, stick that tube in there, knock it in there with a piece of wood, and then stick a small tin underneath it to collect maple syrup. And what they would do with the syrup is they would take it and boil it down and turn it into brown sugar. Brown sugar was the earliest form of sugar in the Americas from maple trees, and then later on they brought in sugar cane from Africa with the Africans to basically harvest it, and it basically destroyed the market of maple syrup. I mean, there's depictions and writings of people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington harvesting their own maple trees or white maple trees in their region to make brown sugar to make rum. Because back in the early days, they didn't make moonshine really. They made rum. Rum was the big harvest type of crop. Rum was the big deal. They would take the corn and they would harvest it up and then make moonshine sort of, and put it in the oak wooden barrels, and then they would add a brown sugar to it to give it its flavor, which basically was rum at the time. Then later on they used sugar cane, but that's how they made rum. Our ancestors, or early founding fathers, used maple syrup to make rum. So they made the rum, and that was the mainstay, like, spirit that everybody drank back in the day, which was worth its weight in gold in our colonial days. They made money on that. They were growing corn to make it. or another type of barley or something to ferment to make early moonshine and thumper kegs and stills. So, but the ancient people didn't have that. That was more of a modern concept. Spirits, like cognacs and stuff made from grapes, and that is a modern concept. They really didn't have like alcohol what we got to today from distilling it in copper pots and stuff like that. Back then they either made a beer or they drank wine. So that's what they got drunk on back in the old days. They made a fermented beer. Basically, a fermented beer is what they use in the process of making spirits like corn. Like you can make corn beer or banana beer or anything potato beer. You know what I'm saying? You could add vegetables to make it taste a little bit better, but basically beer is just fermented grains in water, and you let it rot, and you can sift the grain out of it. It's not going to be like fuzzy like modern beer, but it'll definitely get you drunk, and that's what ancient beers were made out of back in the day, and that's how they got drunk on beers and wines. I don't know if anybody can correct me in this. You can tell me that they made beer out of something else, then let me know. Or they made alcohol. But like right here is what I was talking about, an example of a grist wheel that was basically a big ass stone, a big round stone that was mounted to a piece of wood that had a pivot wheel on it, which would basically act as like uh, an early example of a ball bearing, and it would run around in a circle while one guy would throw some grain down or olives down right there. On the other side of that mill, there was a little opening for a spout, which the oil would leak out or the flour would leach over the mill, which they threw the wheat on that mill grist. They would have a guy, like several dudes on the other side of that handle pushing it in a circle to grind it down, or they would have some kind of like mule hooked up to it or an ox hooked up to it and run that ox around in circles for hours and hours and hours and hours to make flour. And like I said, that was another way they made it. And there was other ways that they used these grist mills to process up. Okay, now we're done with the agriculture and my ramblings. We'll go into the next subject. Uh, okay, guys, the next subject is carpentry tools. Now, this would have been the tools that Jesus would have been using back in the old days: a wooden mallet, a small, like, you know, bronze rasp to basically, like a shaver. They would probably use the bronze rasp to basically, or a stone rasp to basically straighten wood out, and then, use the sandstone to file it down to make it sanded and make it look real nice. Here's a drill. This is an ancient drill, basically made out of, wood and like a little hinge toggle on the top there that would, Jesus probably would have used to drill holes into other pieces of wood with a bronze tip or something like that to drill holes into wood. I don't know exactly what this is. It could be a file, could be a rasp. You got another piece of wood here. I mean, as you can see, it says complement carpentry tools recovered from the wreck of a 16th century sailing ship. So, I mean, yeah, it's ancient, but this is basically the type of tools that Jesus would have been using as well. It's a little bit more modern, 16th century, but still, it's very reminiscent to what Jesus would have been using as a carpenter living in Nazareth before he became a preacher. I think Jesus was still working as a preacher, was working as a carpenter and being a preacher, because you know, uh, most rabbis of the time also had a trade as well, not just a trade in being a preacher. They didn't make their money just off of preaching as a rabbi. They also had a jack of all trades, so they either were a fisherman, they knew how to make nets, or they used carpentry tools like this. And they're probably even more than just this. What Jesus had, he probably had a wooden mallet. He probably had stone tools to cut stones. Uh, you know, from jade heads, chisels, jade chisels to cut stone with round pieces of hammer stones like a ball made out of jade to beat, stone up, and then chisel it away with a wooden mallet and a small jade chisel to make blocks out of stone, or make mud bricks out of, like, basically most of the houses that were built in ancient times were either stone or mud brick. More common stone. More expensive houses were built from cut stone. Less cheaper houses from people who were not as rich as maybe somebody who owned the land, that was working off for the lord of the land or whatever at the time, or the priestly class that owned the land. Uh, would live in mud huts, basically like mud brick houses with thatched roofs, with like mud bricks. So Jesus would have been a jack of all trades. He wouldn't have just been a rabbi. He was preaching. He was also making some money because people would give him money for, because a rabbi wasn't just a teacher. He would come in. He would, use uh, ancient preachings to ward away evil spirits, to like cast out demons out of people's bodies and stuff, which Jesus was known for doing, and healing the sick. They would have been probably very versed with herbs, and to make medicines of the time to help, heal the sick, or Jesus was, if you want to believe he was the Messiah, he could heal people with his supernatural powers, and stuff like that. But this is very reminiscent to the tools that he'd have on him as a carpenter. Those would be the tools. And you can make these tools in a modern survival situation too. You can make a bow drill, to make fire. You can make a bow drill out of the cordage the fibrous cordage that you can find in the wild, like dog's mane, agava, to make a bow drill. They use fire pistons, friction fires, to make their fires in ancient times. They also banged stones together in charred material to start a fire, like basically what they call fool's gold or pyrite, and they would bang it off of an iron ring to make fire. They've even found flint and steel kits in ancient 4,000-year-old Egyptian tombs. They were banging like a piece of iron, uh, an iron basic flint and steel type of striker type of thing, and they would bang stones off of it to make fire with charred materials. They were using fire pistons with little clay round counterbalance weight discs and a small like wooden dowel in between it, with the fibrous material as a cordage on the outside of the fire piston into a hearth board. That's how they made fires as well. They used that also as a drill. Jesus probably would have used a fire piston drill to drill as well, into other pieces of wood, with a piece of hard stone to drill into the wood to make holes, to make chairs, to build tables, whatever, or a bronze type of drill bit, very similar to this one as well. Or they would use like a fire piston drill. If you don't know anything about that, you can watch Primitive Survival's channel, Primitive Skills, whatever those names channel is. And now we're getting into the portion of the Bible of Jesus' time when he went into Galilee. Now, Jesus was a carpenter now. Now, when he was pushed out of Nazareth, because, I guess nobody wanted to believe that he was the Messiah and he was there to fulfill prophecy, he was laughed out of his own temple, and he probably didn't want to preach where he lived because nobody really wanted to listen to him as a preacher. But like I said, Jesus was a carpenter. He went to Galilee. There was plenty of work in Galilee at the time because there was a big demand for carpenters to build ships, boats, for the Galilee fishing fleets. Now, Jesus probably went there for that very reason. He probably was a fisherman himself. He probably learned the trade himself, why he was based there in Galilee. Now, the boats that they used in Galilee weren't really big boats. They were probably like, I don't know, 12 to 13 foot, like wooden uh, row boats that they used in the area. There's been depictions of 2,000 to 3,000 year old boats they found in Galilee, in modern times that were still intact. And most of these boats, when they would build them, they were basically heirlooms, like what their nets were as well. They passed down their boats to their sons or their fathers and build a new boat. Or if a father died, their sons or their daughters would inherit the boat and the family business. So they were heirlooms, or they would patch them together because the ancient boat they found in Israel a couple years ago, I don't know, was it 10, 15 years ago, was basically a boat they found that was patched, and if they ever had a hole in it or it had a rotten spot in it, they'd rip out the rotten spot, put a new patch in it. That's where carpenters came in handy, and that's why they were really sought after in the shipping fleets in Galilee for the fishermen, because they would do repair jobs on boats, or they would build new boats, because a new boat would cost you a lot of money back in the day to build from a carpenter. If you had a carpenter come in, you either bartered with a carpenter, you would give him a portion of your earnings of what you catch to the carpenter in trade for the time it took him to build the boat for you. So basically, you took it in either trade in goods, or you silver, or mainly it was a barter society. I mean, they did get taxed in silver when the Persians came in, and the Babylonians, the Persians, and then the Greeks. They were taxing them as part of their empire. So eventually, they had to use currency. But in Jesus' time, it would have been the Romans. So they would have probably been taxing these guys, but they would trade or barter with carpenters to get work done, and then the carpenter could trade the fish for, and trade for the work that he did on the boats. So they were basically patch jobs. But somebody like Jesus was in high demand on Galilee because, he was a carpenter. He could build boats, or he could figure out how to build a boat, or, you know, build housing, roofing for the house, or furniture for homes and stuff like that. And I wouldn't even doubt that Jesus was a fisherman himself when he did go there to meet Peter and a few the other disciples in the region. He was working. He wasn't just a preacher. He had to make a living. They all did. So they were all working on the side there to make a living, as you can see right here. This is just a depiction of Jesus with the fishing fleets of Galilee. Now you can see they're using a net, right? Now nets would have been very valuable of the time. You know what I mean? They would have been made out of natural materials, like whatever type of hemp, or maybe a milkweed or something like that. But they would line their nets with beeswax to waterproof their nets. They would do it probably every season, fishing season. When one fishing season went out, the next fishing season they would coat their nets because it would make them waterproof. They didn't just use nets. They also used long lines as well from fibrous materials, and they would use gouge hooks, or the modern equivalency of a long line. They would use like a little pointed rose thorn hook and wrap it, and use little clay weights that they would make out of, like at the bottom of the nets, they would use a clay weight. They would weave that clay weight into the bottom of the net, and they would use a cork for the top of the net to float. And they would make these long, I don't know, 50, 60 foot long nets, and they would drag that net behind the boats while they rowed. It would drag the bottom, and fish would get stuck in it, and they would run it into a circle with both boats and run that net into one big circle to trap the fish inside. And then once they did that, they would close the nets off and pull the nets into the boat. Because there's more than one boat. They wouldn't just use one boat. There'd be like a fleet of boats doing this fishing. There'd be two boats, 60, 50 foot long net, gill net, basically, to get the fish stuck in the net. Their gills would get stuck in the net, and they would pull that into a circle and come back and pick those nets up like an hour later. So the fish get stuck in the net, and then they would pull the nets into the boat, and then they would, put the fish in little baskets that they would weave, but like I said, this is an early depiction, probably medieval depiction of Peter and Jesus at the Sea of Galilee. This is what they would have looked like, the kind of boats they would have used. Okay, guys, now this is about as wide as I can get this for the video. But right here where I got this little thing, this cursor moving over here on the side. Now you can see these are the nets, the style of nets they used, and this is a what a first century Galilean fishing boat would have looked like. Now they would have like two or three of these little sailboats running around in the Galilee, and they would have maybe one or two boats at the time uh, running in tandem to use a fishing net. Sometimes they use like a cast net, a type of cast net, or they would use a long drift net. They would cast these big old nets. They find schools of fish. Now, the way they found schools of fish back in the old days is sort of like how fishermen find fish now these days. They would follow seabirds. Wherever they saw seabirds diving into the water to catch fish, that's usually where the boats would congregate to either drop their gill nets or their cast nets. Now, early form of cast nets, as you can see right here, that would Peter would have been throwing that net off the front of the bow of the boat to throw it over and hit a school of fish and bring them in. Um, they used cast nets. They used early gill nets, and now these nets would have been family heirlooms. They would have been. They wouldn't just been thrown away after one season. They would have been, if there was a hole in it, they would fix it. If there was a rotten piece in there, they would fix it. But at the base of the cast net, there would have been clay weights at the bottom. There would have been a wooden toggle in the front with a long line with the rest of the small cordages of line of whatever type of fibrous plant material they would use and waxed it down as a cast net. And they would have a long leash on the net and they would cast it and it would go over a spot and it would land on the fish and they would pull it to the boat basically. Depending on how long the net is, it could have had a 8-foot, 15-foot, up to a 20-foot cast net or a long gill net basically that they would leave out and they would circle and make a big circle and gather a bunch of group of fish in there and they would get stuck, their gills would get stuck in there. But this is basically the type of boat they used. It had a sail, basically like a modern version of a skiff, a wooden skiff that people use in Maine and stuff like that with a sail on it. The sail was basically used to where they can run off go out into the open Sea of Galilee, which is a lake. It's a freshwater lake, and cruise around until they can get back to their villages. It's basically a freshwater sailboat, of ancient proportions. It had the rudder on the side right here, as you can see. That was the rudder of the boat. How they, turned it from right to left, or whenever the boat sail wasn't running, they would use this to kind of like propel the boat forwards. Like I said, they didn't really use big boats in the Sea of Galilee. They were using like little 13 to 14-foot boats. And in Galilee, it does get rough though. Like when Jesus calmed the storm in the Bible, in the New Testament, that they do have really horrendous storms on the Galilee that will capsize these little wooden boats and kill people. Most people back in the ancient days didn't know how to swim, and a lot of people ended up drowning. They didn't have cork flotation devices or none of that stuff back in the old days, so a lot of people ended up drowning and dying. It was a very dangerous job, as much as it is now, and as it was back in the ancient times as well. So a lot of people ended up dying because of it, because they couldn't swim. I mean, most people thought, in medieval times, people that knew how to swim were witches. If you sank and drowned, you weren't a witch and you died. But if you swam, you were considered a witch. You know what I mean? Back in the medieval times. But, even back then, people didn't know how to swim. And if you did know how to swim, it was like taboo to learn how to swim. It's weird. But that's ancient boat right there. That's first century Galilean fishing boat. That they probably would have looked like in Jesus' time when he calmed the storm. I think Jesus was also a fisherman too. He wasn't just living there and preaching to people. He was working. They were all working. They were doing odd jobs. When they moved to a different city with Jesus as his apostles, they were probably working too. And they all became rabbis under Jesus. They all studied and learned. They were probably very influential people. There's a reason why Jesus chose each one of these disciples, is because they came from a rabbinic background. They were probably rabbis of their local parishes, or their local temples. You know what I'm saying? So that's why Jesus chose each one of these people. Very smart. Even the tax collectors were very intelligent. They knew how to read and write. Matthew was a tax collector, the most reviled person in in Jewish culture was a tax collector. They couldn't stand Matthew, but Matthew became one of the most important disciples. Very smart. So were these fishermen. They were probably rabbis. They were all rabbis, probably. That's why Jesus chose these disciples, was because they come from either a background where they could write and read. They were also probably professionals in their own fields. They were probably, most people back in the ancient times were jack of all trades. They were all tradesmen. They knew how to build houses. They knew how to work wood. They knew how to be carpenters with fishermen and all this other stuff. They had to learn all this stuff, as a trade. Although they were fishermen, they were probably also carpenters as well. They were versed in multiple trades. You had to be a jack of all trades to be a survivalist in ancient times. That's why I always say you could apply a lot of the ancient trades to modern survival techniques and skills in survival. Okay, up next, what we're going to show you is fishing tools. Now, these are early example of wooden hooks, stone hooks, and thorn hooks used by ancient fishermen of Jesus' time. Gouge hooks, you have the little straight hooks made from bone, stone, thorn hooks, and you also had wooden hooks as well. As you can see, these are examples of the wooden hooks that were made from like little pieces of wood that were a V shape that they can cut down and use a small stone tool to hone it down into either a hook or a gouge hook. These are very common. Over here we have a thorn hook right here. We have wooden hooks right here, another thorn and wood hook. Basically ancient primitive tools that were made to make long lines. They may have used the long line technique as well, which, what is a long line? Is multiple hooks on a one piece of material that was waxed and coated in wax, which was a fibrous material to make fishing line, and each one of those individual hooks was a gouge hook they would tie a piece of bait to, and they would run a big heavy stone on the very end of the, what they call a trout line now these days, but a big heavy stone that they would drop, either clay stone as a weight to weigh it down, and they would find a tree limb to tie it to near the bank, and it would be a really long line, and they would throw each hook over that they would bait at one time, and then take that boat out and drop it out that weight in the deeper part of the water, and then when they come back a couple hours later to retrieve that, they untie the cordage from the tree that was near the bank, and they would, or a pole they would stick into a deep part of the water that they would tie it off to, that way they can find it later. They would come back and pull the fish in one at a time very gently, because it was very dangerous, because if you had a really big fish on there and you were fighting that big fish, all those other hooks that you brought in could gouge your legs and pull you into the water and drown to death. There was a lot of deaths because of that type of longline fishing in probably Galilee for bigger fish. They didn't just use cast nets, they used gouge hooks, like the straight gouge hooks on the side over here. These are what they call straight gouge hooks, and these are gill gouge hooks right here, made either from thorn, a branch from a rose bush or a thorn. They would tie the baits to these, and they would use like a clay weight at the very end to keep the long lines down. They would run more than one long line. They probably run 3 or 4 long lines out in the lake, in the Sea of Galilee, to catch bigger fish like carp and tilapias with these long lines, and they would come back. I mean, they wouldn't get a hell of a lot of fish, but that was basically one of the main staples of the early Jewish people's diet was fish and lamb. They rarely ate meat. They were more grain type of people. They would eat a lot of grain stuff, a lot of grain, a lot of tomatoes, stuff like that. Like figs, fruits. They would kind of stay away. They didn't eat pork. That was like a sin meat to them. They couldn't eat pork. Then they rarely ate beef. Beef was like, the rich elite class. These are the hooks they used. They also used spears as well in creeks and rivers. They would use a three-pronged spear made out of bone and wood or something like that, and they would go into the water in a river or a lake and stab fish, at night with uh, basically torches. They would hold the torch down in the water, and whenever they saw a fish with the torch, they would hit it with the spear, and they would put it in like a little burlap or a type of little sack on their side that they would fill up with fish made out of like a little basket made out of you know fibrous material that they would stick the fish into with a spear in creek beds. But in the ocean, or they were fishing in the ocean, or they were fishing in the Sea of Galilee, they would use long lines, or they would use cast nets, or basically long gill nets. Okay, guys, here is one of the ancient examples of nets that Jesus would have probably used in ancient times. This is an early version of a fibrous plant material type of cast net that was made from fibrous plant materials. As you can see over here, some hooks too. They have ancient hooks right here, probably made from bronze, cast bronze. During Jesus' time, they probably used for long lines. They probably used gallows hooks too. Here's an example of a Egyptian fellow using a cast net in Egypt, but it's basically the same concept of the type of fishing Jesus did in his time in the Sea of Galilee in their little ancient boats, as well as the long pull drift nets, gill nets, as well as they used in the Holy Land as well. Like I said, they used long lines, drift nets, which basically were heirlooms, and they would hand these nets down from father to son to father over the years. If there were some bad spots in the net, they would fix it, but the net was never, ever thrown away. They would never throw these nets away. They would just fix them or add to the nets. You know what I'm saying? Here's an example in the Holy Land of them pulling in a net from the Sea of Galilee. This is a picture of the Holy Land right here. This is a modern adaptation, but this is the same kind of concept of the nets they used, gill nets they used in ancient times, that they would use 2 or 3 boats to go out and drag the bottom of the Galilee, and then circle back and go to shore and pull these nets into shore, and whatever they found in the nets is what they processed up and took to the market to sell as food for fish, because that was the main staple diet in Israel at the time. The way they made these nets is they used wax fibrous materials based on plants, they find in their little local region. Then they would use beeswax to coat the line. That way it lasted longer. They probably coated these nets every year or so. They would get beeswax, get it hot underneath a can or a lamp, and then rub the strings and the cordages around the nets to weatherproof it or waterproof it so they last forever. If they get a hole in the net from where they dragged it on a rock or something and it ripped the net, they would just fix the spot. These nets would be handed down from father to son and their families. Fishing was a family endeavor. The whole family got involved. Brothers, sisters, uncles, nieces, grandfathers would get involved in dragging the nets, being in the boats, catching the fish, because it was a family business. These nets would have been very valuable. As you can see here, they would use corks on the top of the nets, and they would use clay, small counterbalance weights on the bottom so they could drag the net to shore, which would capture the fish when they circled the nets with the boats. This is a modern adaptation to it. I'm sure they're probably using nylon rope now in this net, but in ancient times they used drag nets like that, basically a drift net or a gill net or a drag net made out of plant fibers waxed with beeswax. You know what I'm saying? So Is the Sea of Galilee. Beautiful. This is where Jesus went in his last days, teaching people how to fish. And that might not be Galilee, but it's very, very similar to how they fished in Galilee, catching the fish. Now, these are probably uh, tilapias. What is this? Peter's Fish, Sea, Galilee, photo of Pharaoh chicken. So these are the fish that they're pulling out of the Galilee. I'm thinking these are probably tilapia. This is a very fish staple of the type of fish they were eating during the ancient days when Jesus was there. It doesn't say what type of fish this is. It might, I don't know. It looks like a tilapia. It's basically like, a ancient worlds panfish, basically like their version of bluegill, basically. Good eating fish. They could live in brackish water, right along with, you know, in brackish water. They're probably tilapia. They probably eat some kind of like, I don't know, small fish, basically like bait fish looking fish, probably like sardines or a smaller fish. I'm not too sure about their fish they catch there and eat, but like I said, it's probably tilapias. Probably, I think Roland Martin did a fishing video once on the Sea of Galilee, and they went tilapia fishing. I don't think he caught anything, but I think they even have a catfish there. But in Jewish tradition, they're not allowed to eat fish that don't have scales. So the fish they eat have to have scales. They target certain species of fish, but catfish is a big no-no. So they probably don't eat catfish. I think they got like types of marble uh, chubs there as well in places like the Jordan River. I watched a couple fishing videos from a guy that lives in the Jordan area from Israel, and he was fishing in the Jordan. He was catching like marble chubs, catfish, their version of a catfish. I don't know exactly the species. I'm not from there, so they basically are pulling tilapias, eating marble chubs. They're probably eating, whatever indigenous fish species that live in the region. I mean, even the Persians fish like this as well in Persia, which is modern day Iran. The tribal people use long cast nets to cast in their rivers there, from high mountain tops to catch fish. It's a very ancient fishing technique. They use cast netting, long drift nets to drag to shore, you know, gill nets and stuff like that. Well, guys, I hope you liked this video on sort of survival, and you can make nets yourself. Like if you wanted to make a net, like a cast net for survival, or make a long line, trout line from these fishing lines from like plant materials, you can as well. You can make a dog's bane fishing long line with a piece of stone at the bottom, and make a bunch of like gouge hooks on that line and throw it from the bank, tie it off to the bank and throw it out in the deepest part of a river or a lake and catch and do survival fishing that way. You can make a hand set to make a single like hobo type of fishing kit, but like, the ancient way they did it out of a piece of wood. Like they would latch two pieces of wood together and make two wooden dowels to hold it in place as a hand line, to run it as a hand line. There's plenty of videos out there of guys making fishing kits, ancient survival fishing kits with gouge hooks and natural cordage, wax cordage for fishing hand line sets as well. Okay, guys. Now this is the type of cordage they would have been using in, Israel at the time to make their nets, their clothing, basically everything in everyday life, and everyday carry for Jesus. They would carry like a bronze knife. Iron was prevalent, but it was too expensive, so they probably carried bronze tools on them with you know stone tools. Even in the Iron Age, they were still using bronze to stone tools. I mean, even the Utsi man had a stone knife, but he had a bronze axe and a bronze wedge to split wood. And he used the bronze axe to cut the wood down. I mean, so even 4,000 years ago, Utsi man was carrying this. He still was using a stone tool neck knife. So, I mean, he was even using plant material, fibered clothing as well. So, even in ancient biblical times, poor rural tribal people would use plant materials because cotton, like I said, was expensive. It was around at the time, but the Egyptians grew it, and it grew on the Nile Basin, and it was one of the biggest crops for them, but only really um, influential people could afford cotton. So you got like this type of material. I don't know exactly what this plant is. It is bark removed from a flowering uh, thumu, Thymugorato hisuta scrub. This is probably the material they used in Jesus' time to make their nets and their everyday fabrics to weave clothing and stuff like that. Here's the cordage that they make from it. They either made it by hand. This is how they make their fishing lines. This is, basically they would twist one side, of the cordage and then twist it over and then twist one side and then twist it over to make cordage. Basically, bushcrafters do this now to make cordage. If you're in a survival situation and you don't have paracord, this will be your next best bet to make this cordage. You can make it thinner to make it smaller. They probably had wooden machines that you could twist around that they made the cordage from as well. They didn't just do it by hand, but um, if you're poor, you probably couldn't afford those type of, or even build those type of cordage machines, or cordage rakes to basically get the fibers out of the dried materials. You had to harvest it, pull it, the bark off, and then, or the outer weed bark out, and then dry it for like a month, and then turn it into a dried material to where you could process up the fibers from the outer layer of the weed or the bark or whatever you're using. Like dog's bane, it's the outer layer. With milkweed, it's the outer layer of the weed. Whenever it's dried, then you have to crush it and then pull off the inner part of the weed out, and then you just get the outer strands to turn it into cordage. Like I said, this is the process in making the cordage, but you have to dry it out, and then when it's dry, you can use a cordage rake to, you know, get those fibers or roll it in your hand like this to expose the fibers, But that's how the ancients made rope back in the old days, You could make clothing out of it. Like I said, there's different plants that they use in Israel. This is daffodil stem. I guess this would be their version of dog's bane in Israel. Young daffodil stem. I guess it's a plant there, and they're peeled back strips, plied rope or string. So they're using this plant here, this weed here, to make cordage out of in Jesus' time. Daphnes, the Daphne. I can't say it. I'm sorry, but this is the plant they're using in Jesus' time. Here in America, we use dog's bane, milkweed, but this is the plant that they used in Jesus' time to make fibrous rope. I'm sure they used hemp too. This is just basically what they probably used in their area. They made cloth from this. They made their nets from this. They probably made ropes for their plows and ropes to bind their roofs together to latch, straw into their roofs from their wooden roofs. I mean, this is just survival cordage 101. They probably could fluff it out and make it into a tinder bundle as well for fire making. Once you put an ember in it, you can blow it to flame. But basically, there's your ancient equivalency of the type of cordage they used in the Galilee to make their nets, to basically fix their nets, to use the cordage to make shelters, to for the roofs, to latch their tools together with pitch and pine and this. They'll latch their hoes and their their knives, and even Jesus probably used stone knives. You know what I'm saying? And you know, I don't think they were very rich. Jesus and his followers were very rich, so they were probably using bronze tools. They were probably using lesser bronze tools, stone tools. They weren't just using more expensive iron. Iron was really expensive back in the day, and they only made like swords, and they made like armor out of it. It was really expensive. It was more for the military than it was for the common man. The common man used either stone tools or he was using bronze or copper. So you use that's what they use basically in everyday life for harvesting tools. They used it for knives. They used it for drill bits, whatever. If they didn't use that, they were using stone tools. So they were still using stone tools even back then. 4,000 years ago in the Bronze Age, Uzi man was still using a Uzi knife. So that just proves that they were still using stone tools with a mixture of copper and bronze as well, which was poor man's tool anyways. And it was easier to smelt than say iron. Iron was really hard to smelt. It took a lot of man hours in several smelting processes, just to make a little bit of material just to make a knife. So it was a lot easier to get a lot more material out of tin and copper to make bronze, or copper and smelt it to make tools quick and fast that worked. I mean, they weren't the best tools. They were soft metal, but they still worked. Copper axe could cut down a tree just as good and faster than a wooden handled stone axe. You know what I mean? Or a bronze or copper sickle saw was better to cut down trees and easier to sharpen than a flint harvester, like sickle harvester. You know what I mean? A bronze plowhead was better than a copper or bronze plowhead was better than a stone plowhead, but still, like I said, it would cost a small fortune for a bronze plowhead, or even because most of the time they were either smelting the stuff themselves or they were buying it or trading for it. A significant portion of your crops would go to the temple as an offering, or you were really just taxed out of the buttocks back in the old days. I mean, a portion of your crops went to the temple as a tithe. If you couldn't afford to pay in silver, they would take a portion of your goods to pay for the temple tithes. If you weren't being taxed by the temple, you were being taxed by the empires of the day. They needed a portion of your crop, to pay for their wars and their extravagant lifestyles. So they were basically, the common man was taxed into oblivion and had to settle with less, so they couldn't afford a whole lot. So, and if they did, it was a family heirloom and they passed it down from family member to family member. Okay, guys, I hope you like this quick going back into Bible times of what kind of things they used and type of survival tools. Our ancestors were the earliest survivalists back in the day, and even in Bible times. I just wanted to give y'all a quick glimpse of how people lived back in the old days and what type of tools they use for fishing and everyday life, like in their survival scenarios. I mean, they were literally survivalists. I think we have gotten tame now these days, gotten complacent. I mean, you stack any ancient person against a modern human being in a survival situation, that modern human being would die within a few days. That ancient person would thrive in a survival situation and outpace anybody. You know what I'm saying? They would, that other person be crying and losing their mind in a survival situation and die. This person would thrive. It would survive. They would make a hunting tool out of the fibrous material, like a sling to kill birds, or kill deer, or kill a rabbit or something. You know what I'm saying? They didn't mess around. They would make a bow out of a survival bow out of the string that he made from the fibrous materials of the plants, and a tree that would bend, and that would be a good bow stave to make for a bow and arrow. They would be making arrows right on the fly like that to make hunting arrows, and go out within 10 minutes and come back with either a dead bird, a rabbit, or a freaking deer, while the modern human being would be sitting there crying and whining and not knowing what to do. You know what I'm saying? So I hope y'all like this video on some Bible history and how people lived, agriculture, tools they used in ancient times, from fishing to agriculture to carpentry as well. And, just my researching of it, and knowing a little bit of the history of, the Bible and some history of the Bible. I don't know it all. Like I said, I'm not perfect, but like I said, this is a good way of what they knew back then. You could apply to your own survival situation now, and the type of plants that you could find in your own area, like dog's bane. Just plants that were highly sought after by Native American tribes to make cordage and clothing from, because they didn't always wear animal skins, guys. You think, you see all these stupid caveman movies that are wearing animal skins and blah, blah, blah. They didn't really use a lot of animal skins. They made clothing out of fibrous materials like this material here in ancient Egypt, in probably Israel. It probably grew everywhere. But the Native Americans used um, fibrous materials to make blankets, to make clothing. They didn't always use buckskin to make clothing. Occasionally they did. Now, buckskin was more used for wintertime because it shedded a lot of the moisture from winter, and moccasins. But most of the time, people like native peoples wore sandals here in America made from fibrous materials in the summer and spring months. And then later on in the wintertime, they wore moccasins in the winter. That was the only time they ever wore moccasins. And they carried more than one moccasin, and they would make like clothing from fibrous materials that they would weave into a thread, and they would, weave it into a shirt, a pair of pants for you know, for their sons or their daughters, or make dresses for their daughters out of fibrous plants like hemp. They did it with nettle, milkweed, cattails, stuff like that. Then they would dip it in beeswax to make it water resistant. They would make robes out of that coats. But, they would use coats from animal skins too, but only as a frock to repel water in certain situations. They didn't always wear animal skins in ancient times, or even our Native American ancestors didn't wear animal skins all the time. They used fibrous materials to make their blankets, to weave blankets, to make their clothing. Not so much their teepees. If they were making teepees, they would use like buffalo skin, and they would, tan it in its own brain, buffalo brain, to make it waterproof, and they would seal it with wax on the skin and run ridge poles. The Indians would. Now the Jews didn't really do that because they didn't really have a lot of rain, so they really didn't need a too much of a animal skin to do that. I'm sure they did use the animal skins for sandals, and they used materials like fibrous materials to make the sandals, you know, cordage to tie the sandals around their legs and their feet to protect their feet from stones. Um, but it was very rare, and they usually would weave sandals out of that, you know what I mean, from materials like that. Well, guys, if you like this video on some ancient history and some survival stuff that they did in the old days and how they survived and the stuff they used in the ancient biblical times to, like I said, I don't know how to pronounce this flowering Telogula histala shrub type of thing they use in Israel to make cordage, but I'm just sharing some shared knowledge from my own Native American background with ancient type of knowledge that they used in ancient times. They still use this. They still make the rope out of this and cordage out of it in Israel still to this day. As you can see, some Bedouins using the cordage to make a camel pack holster right here on the camel, you know what I mean, to hold their water containers and all this other stuff to make rope. So this is still being used in ancient time, in modern times, in Israel, and probably in the overall whole of the Middle East as well. Okay, guys, if you like this video, smash the like, share, and subscribe. This has been your old pal Hondo. It's a long video. I'm sorry, guys, but if you like it, find it informative, hit the like, share, subscribe. Hondo out. Love y'all. Bye bye. God bless.